What Problems Are Inherent in the Portrayal of Native American Culture by Rebecca Burrows and Jack Birkin. In this visual essay, we're going to be looking at presentations of Native American culture in the present. We'll also be looking at some sources from the 1870s in order to contextualise our arguments and to see some comparisons. We've chosen the 1870s for this purpose because it was a decade of particular significance in Native American history, due to, for example, the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871 and the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. This graph is from Francis A. Walker's Statistical Atlas of the United States, published in 1874. It shows a relatively high population of Native Americans in western states, such as Oregon, Nevada and Washington, compared to a relatively low population in eastern states such as Virginia and New York. If we compare the graph from the 1870s to this population distribution map from 2010, we can see that the broad east-west divide has persisted. However, there are fewer Native Americans in total, and they are mainly living in isolated pockets, for example the dark green area in the southwest, which is the Navajo Reservation.
Literary representations of Native American culture. Native Americans have a tradition of oral rather than written history. Therefore, any English language literature that claims to be Native American cannot be so, or at least it cannot be authentic Native American because it is mediated by white US culture. In Gerald Visner's Manifest Manners, Post-Indian Warriors of Surveillance, Maurice Blanchot describes how writing is not destined to leave traces, but to erase them and ensure they are wrapped up in writing. If not, the traces are left to become forgotten and lost in time. This was why many Americans wanted to write down the history of Native Americans, but as we have said, this is not without problems. Many of these stories have been changed, consciously or not, therefore altering the true message of the story and destroying the authenticity of the piece. To illustrate this point, the Navajo creation story can be expressed as a sand painting, as it is here. However, the version found in the Norton Anthology of American Literature is written in English. This can make the story both more or less vulnerable to alteration. There is no guarantee of a true replication due to things being lost in translation. These are two completely different cultures, and there is no way of ensuring everything that is wanted to be said. It is unfortunate that we can see here even the foundations of Native American history are susceptible to change and influence from Western civilizations. Native American oral history is not as powerful as those stories that are written down and published, as Visner writes. Once stories are published, they are read at unnamed distances across the world. For example, we are British students studying Native America. Visner points out that to be heard is to undermine the literature of dominance, whereas to write and be read is to fall into the trap of simulation. Because the tradition for Native Americans is to pass on stories through oral repetition, it creates white cultural hegemony in America. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey is a story told by Chief Bromden, a Native American in a US psychiatric hospital. He does not speak, instead he writes, showing a recapturing of Native American storytelling via the literature of dominance. If we were to apply this to US society at large, we might say that Chief Bromden, like many Native Americans, is muted by white institutions and is forced to use the literature of dominance to express himself. As we have seen, this is a flawed arrangement. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is a Native American history written by D. Brown. It details the oppression suffered by Native Americans due to US expansionism and allows them to express their perspective on the injustices they have suffered under the US government. D. Brown draws on the real experiences of Native Americans after working in a library where he was able to find primary documents such as treaties written in Native American languages. Therefore, although this book is written in English, it goes some way towards reclaiming Native America from the literature of dominance. In the New York Times, Scott Momaday says the book is so hard to put aside even when one has come to an end. This book has had a lasting effect as it tells the truth of Native American history from those who suffered it.
It did for the Cherokee people in just 12 years what it took other civilizations thousands of years to accomplish. Beginning work in 1809, he created a written language. Technically a syllabary rather than an alphabet, the Cherokees called it talking leaves, a satire of the white man's written word which dried up and blew away. Sequoia's did not. It made it possible for the average Cherokee speaker to learn to read and write in just a couple of weeks.
Sequoia's Cherokee syllabary shows a rejection of the English language. In a way, the Cherokee were isolating themselves, but this in itself caused problems. For example, it deepened the pre-existing language barriers between the Cherokee and the United States. There are many problems in the portrayal of Native Americans relating to literature, but the most prominent is the problem of communication and translation, whereby things get lost and therefore the representation is not authentic. But to fully grasp the truth is impossible, as it will not have been written down in Native American languages, perhaps except the Cherokee. On the other hand, the literature that is available, although not completely authentic, still allows us to gain a better understanding of Native American culture.
Representations of Native Americans in photographs and art. As Roland Barthes said in Mythologies 1957, we shall therefore take language, discourse, speech, etc. to mean any significant unit or synthesis, whether verbal or visual. A photograph will be a kind of speech for us in the same way as a newspaper article. In the light of this, we might expect to see the same kind of patterns in the representations of Native Americans in photographs and art as we've seen in literary representations. For example, in the art of Matt Coyote, who's a Navajo artist, we see distinctively Native American themes as evidenced by the titles of his artworks Father and Son, Skywind and Big Chief. However, is it problematic that Matt Coyote uses the internet to market his artwork, or that we've collected these images for the purposes of this essay using the internet, which is a distinctively white American invention? In contrast to Matt Coyote, Wayne Eagleboy's We the People from 1971 attempts to subvert the patriotic meaning of the Stars and Stripes. We can see Native Americans behind barbed wire in the top left corner, showing that they're simultaneously trapped within and excluded from the American nation. Also, We the People is painted onto buffalo skin, which shows us that Wayne Eagleboy is attempting to escape from the dominant form of American art, perhaps in the same way that D. Brown is attempting to escape from US literary dominance. Similarly, if we look at the photography of Edward Curtis from the 1870s, which was collected into a portfolio, The North American Indian, we can see that Curtis focuses on the differences between Native American culture and white American culture, such as living conditions, ceremonial costume, and the natives' relationship with nature. As we might expect due to this, many of Curtis' photographs can appear staged, which we might extend to say is inherent in the photographic form. Following on from this, we can see that Larry McNeil's Native Epistemology 2004 and Mass, Mass and More Mass 2006 directly reference Edward Curtis and highlight the staged nature of his photography. They're the photographic equivalent of Wayne Eagleboy's We the People from 1971, in that they subvert the photographic traditions surrounding Native Americans that began with Curtis in the 1870s. And so, as predicted, we can see that there are similarities between the representations of Native American culture in literature and in photography or art. To a certain and perhaps inescapable extent, Native American self-expression has been infiltrated by white American culture, although there have been attempts to escape this, notably through subversion.
In an age of constant technological advance, there has been a portrayal of Native Americans through cinema and other visual media. Whether cinema centres on Native Americans or merely features them, it usually relies on a myth, which Roland Barthes has called second-order semiological system. As we shall see, this myth is fairly consistent throughout cinematic portrayals of Native Americans. Westerns are mostly associated with cowboys and Indians and the conflict between them. Peter Cowie writes that early Eurocentric Westerns frequently portray the Indians as dishonourable villains, whereas later and more culturally neutral Westerns, notably those directed by John Ford, gave Native Americans a more sympathetic treatment. The term cowboys and Indians often equates to the idea of good and evil. Hollywood was especially white, and it is questionable to what extent this has changed. This shows in films in which white guys become the heroes. There is also an irony in the title of the genre, as the West was the home of the Indians before the westward expansion. This is what Peter Cowie means by Eurocentric. This next clip is from Back to the Future 3, and it shows a stereotypical view of the Native Americans. As you can see, Marty is very scared of them as they're portrayed as violent when chasing the DeLorean. There's also an irony within this scene as the horses are chasing a car and they show the difference in technological advances between white men and Indians. Disney's Peter Pan and Pocahontas both depict animated Native America. Peter Pan shows stereotypes of Native Americans, the big chief hat, teepees, smoking and a tribal dance. Although they are very stereotypical, it does acknowledge many traditions of Native American culture. The following clip contrasts the red man with the white British children, and as John Darling says, the education about why the red man is red will be very enlightening. This demonstrates the lack of education about Native Americans across the world. It is interesting to point out that it is children who are the ones interested in learning about Native Americans. Although this may not be intentional, it could send the message that adults have simply become ignorant to learning about the Native American.
Teach 'em, pale-faced brother, all about Red Man.
Good. This should be most enlightening.
Pocahontas is based on the early colonisation of Virginia. Pocahontas herself has in a way been othered in this film. She looks different from other Disney princesses. Her skin is a different colour and the clothes she wears are a lot shorter. On the whole, the film does show that Native Americans were not evil as the English governor believes. Rather, it is the English, notably not white Americans, whom Pocahontas seems to hold responsible for Native American genocide. Both Peter Pan and Pocahontas use British characters to highlight their ignorance towards Native Americans, but even then the culture is being presented in a watered down way and it is not a true representation of Native culture.
Barely even human. Drive them from our shore. They're not like you and me, which means they must be evil. We must stop them from the war.
Continuing with Walt Disney, this is the original concept art for Frontierland, Disneyland, California. It is a recreation of the American West and celebrates its pioneers, but in doing so it negatively portrays the Native Americans. It is what John Baudrillard calls the hyperreality. It is a model of something that has never existed to begin with. It neither has nor had a reality. In this video clip, the hyperreality of Disneyland is seen, as is the negative portrayal of Native Americans.
Frontierland is a tribute to the faith, courage, and ingenuity of the pioneers who blazed the trails across America. We find ourselves back in the exciting days when the story of our country's past was being lived.
A settler's cabin is on fire. Indians must have done it. It's Fort Wilderness, and there's old Davy Crockett. He'll take care of those bad-acting Indians.
We began by asking the question, what problems are inherent in the portrayal of Native American culture? In comparison to the 1870s, there is a reduced and endangered population of Native Americans, which perhaps renders the problem of their representation more pertinent than it has ever been. All of the categories of media we have mentioned, literature, photography and art, and visual media, are inescapably affected by white cultural hegemony in the United States. With regard to literature, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and the Cherokee Syllabary represent attempts on the part of Native Americans to reclaim forms of white cultural dominance for themselves. This is more marked when we come to study photography. The photographs of Edward Curtis from the 1870s have been superseded by those of photographers like Larry McNeil, whose work, like that of Wayne Eagleboy, subverts white perceptions of Native America. This is the primary way in which Native Americans can successfully reclaim their own representation. However, this is not so obvious when we come to study visual media and cinema, perhaps because it is more difficult for Native Americans to gain any kind of cultural ownership over these forms, which are dominated in the United States by Hollywood. It would make for interesting further research to look at the presence of Native Americans in Hollywood. In addition to this, the primary purpose of movies is to entertain, not to educate, perhaps unlike art and literature, which can give us a more valuable insight into Native American culture. The overwhelming popularity of Hollywood in the US in comparison to these forms, like photography, art and literature, does not bode well for the future portrayal of Native Americans.